All right, the next part of the lesson, we are going to be writing our system of inequalities and then graphing it. So the best way to approach a story problem is to read through the entire thing, then go back and list the information that we know, and then start working on writing a system. And sometimes you might have to read the problem, 4 or 5 times before you're ready to start solving it, to really understand what it's telling you and what it's asking you to do. All right, so for this problem, it says Chelsea has final exams in calculus, physics, and history. She has up to 25 hours to study for exams. She plans to study history for 2 hours. She needs to spend at least 7 hours studying for calculus, but over 14 is too much. She hopes to spend between 8 and 12 hours on physics, and we are supposed to write and graph a system of inequalities to represent the situation. So we're just going to start by writing down what we know from the problem. Okay, so if we start just at the beginning, so we're talking about calculus, physics, and history. And we have a total of 25 hours to study. Okay, so total 25 hours. All right, so we are going to study history for exactly 2 hours. Okay, so history is 2 hours. We need to spend at least 7 for calculus, but not over 14. Okay. So calculus, we are going to spend between 7 to 14 hours studying. And we need to spend between 8 and 12 hours on physics. All right, so now that we have all that information, we can start looking at our problem to figure out what we want our variables to represent. So that's going to be our next step. So when we're looking at this, so the time is kind of like the major theme. So our equations are going to be in terms of time. And when I'm looking at this, it looks like we need to define our variables for the time we spend studying for calculus and the time we spend studying for physics. So I'm going to have x represent the number of hours studied for calculus. Okay, so number of hours studied for calc. And then we're going to have physics be the y. So again, number of hours studied for physics. So if we give us a total, so we start kind of trying to work our way through our inequalities. If they're giving us a total, something has to be less than or equal to that. So I know that something has to be less than or equal to 20, our total number of hours, that 25. Now we do need to be a little bit careful on this problem because it gives us a range and then a set time. So if I know that I'm only going to study 2 hours, when I'm looking at this, we really need to combine the total and the history together. So if I study for, or I have a total of 25 hours to study from, and I'm taking away 2 hours to give to history, that means that we're left with 23 hours. So that's our new total. So that's going to be my number here. So something has to be less than or equal to my total number of hours. Now, to figure out that, we would just take the total number of hours that we study for calculus plus our total number of hours studied for physics, and that together has to be less than or equal to that 23. Now this one, so calc is between 7 and 14 hours, so that means that we would just put our variable in between those numbers. So 7 has to be less than or equal to x, which has to be less than or equal to 14. And then physics is going to be the same way. So it's a range of hours. So 8 is less than or equal to y, which has to be less than or equal to 12. So this is the system that we want to graph. So remember, when we are graphing inequalities or equations, we want it to be in the form of y equals if we can. So for this first one, we're actually going to go through and solve it for y. So we're going to subtract the x over. So we would have y less than or equal to negative x plus 23. And then these we can't solve for, so we just have to know that we're going to have two vertical lines, so 1 through 7, 1 through 14, and we'll have two horizontal lines, 1 through 8 and 1 through 12. So on the graph, we only need to be in the first quadrant, so I'm just going to make that picture my x and y axis. And since we have to go all the way up to 23 for our y-intercept, I'm going to count by 2's. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and 24. Same thing on my x. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and 24. And now I'm going to start putting my lines on there. So if we just graph our top equation, we're going to start up at 23. And then as long as your scale is the same for both your x and y, we can still follow our slope rules. So I'm going to go down one box over one. So down one over one. And the points, the number of points that you put doesn't really matter. Usually for these problems, because sometimes we'll be asked to find the intersections, I like to do more points just so that I make sure that my line is nice and straight, or if it's not, I at least know where the point is supposed to be. And then since it's less than, we're going to shade below. So I'm just going to put a little shading underneath the line up here to remind myself of that. And then we'll do the overlap shading at the very end of our problem. So the next one, we're going to have some vertical lines. So I'm going to make these green. So a vertical line through 7. And then a vertical line through 14. And we are shading in between. So again, I'm just going to put a little shading to remind myself of that. And we'll make next one's pink. So these are going to be horizontal. So I'm going to find 8 on the y and make a horizontal line. And then 12. And again, so we have to be in between these two lines. So I need to be in between my vertical lines, in between the horizontal lines, and below the blue line. So the shading for all of that is going to be in this region right here. And for this question, it's just asking us to write our system, so that's this part right here, and then to graph it. So that would be the one thing that we just did.